Hey guys, it's Trafotin. It's time for another Linux video. Have you ever heard of the GNOME desktop environment? Oh, I'm sorry. It's actually the GNOME desktop environment. Where do they say you pronounce this? I don't know. Have I actually bothered to look into that? No, I haven't. I need to say it that way because if I don't say it that way, the AI software I use to generate my subtitles is going to get confused and not format it correctly or not know what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to say GNOME because if I don't say GNOME, it's not going to know what it is. So that way I can use GNOME to gnome on all of you. All right, great. Have you ever tried using the GNOME desktop environment? It's the default desktop environment of Ubuntu and Fedora and many other Linux distributions. But how many people really use GNOME? And I mean really use GNOME. Lots of Linux distributions actually don't include GNOME the way its developers intended. More on that later. They make all sorts of little modifications. Sometimes they add some plugins. Sometimes they make it look a lot like Windows. Sometimes they add a lot of extra applications on top of it. Instead, I want to take a deep dive into examining the default GNOME experience, the way GNOME's developers intended it, and why the default GNOME experience provides one of the most optimal and interesting workflows of all Linux desktop environments, and why I believe some new users could actually benefit from using the default GNOME experience. So to unpack the GNOME experience, the first thing that we all need to collectively understand is the GNOME Human Interface Guidelines. The Human Interface Guidelines, or HIG, provide a basis as to how GNOME functions and the why of GNOME. Why GNOME is the way that it is, and what makes it as a desktop environment. And it's based upon the following principles. It's designed for people. Where possible, GNOME tries to be accessible to the most number of people possible, no matter what device they use, what their background is, or how able that person is. The other thing GNOME tries to do is keep everything simple. The best apps do one thing and do it well, which in essence is the Unix philosophy. And this often requires having very concise or detailed goals onto why an app is the way that it is. By keeping an app simple, what that does is it removes a lot of the complexity so that a new user or someone who doesn't know the application very well can always dive in and understand the application. But it isn't just keeping this application's interface simple, it's all about keeping the code in a simplistic state so that developers don't have as much burden when they're maintaining something that has a ton of features that might not always get equal attention. It's to make sure that the out-of-the-box experience, whether the person is a user or a developer, has the best experience. But what does this actually look like in practice? And I actually want to use this with real examples of why the GNOME workflow is the way that it is, or at very least the way GNOME tries to subtly push people to use their workflow. Now, a common comparison that I hear is a lot of people say that the GNOME desktop environment is a lot like macOS. It's often very rigid, doesn't allow for a lot of user input. I don't think that actually captures a lot of it because there is actually a bit of user input, and sometimes more tangible user input than what you'd experience in other mainstream desktop environments, for example. But the primary thing that I want to focus on is one of the things that's critical to understanding the GNOME workflow and why I believe that it can benefit new users compared to other desktop environments. In certain scenarios, I understand that most people are acclimated to using Windows or Mac OS, and when they come to something like Linux for the first time, it's a big stretch, or they want something to be the same. But in some ways, using something that's incredibly different might be better for people. And I have actually experienced this with people I know in real life, because when they experience something like Linux for the first time, a good way to at least introduce a little bit of difference or culture shock into them is to use something that's unique to Linux and not like Windows and not like Mac OS, so they don't treat it the same. And this is why I believe that we should always promote something like the GNOME desktop environment. The GNOME desktop environment is not only the default on most Linux distributions or accessible on most Linux distributions, but one of the things that I want to focus on is the GNOME desktop environment provides freedom from the conventional workflows that you will see in Windows-like desktops, Mac-like desktops, or even tiling window managers. GNOME is somewhere in between a tiling window manager that wants to be a desktop environment. It's something that wants to stay out of the user's way, but allow them to get the work they need done, but still bears a lot of the familiar things that make up things we know, like Windows, Mac OS, heck, even KDE. But enough blabbing about what GNOME is supposed to be and why we should convince people to use it. Let's actually dive into using GNOME itself. On the top, we have a black panel, and the black panel is pretty minimal. It's really small, and it shows lots of things here. On the top left, we have the virtual desktops, or as GNOME calls them, workspaces. Your workspaces are like virtual desktops on Mac or on other Linux distributions. With virtual desktops, you can use them to place other windows and keep them away and separate from the display that you're currently on. That way you can have multiple things open and cycle through displays using something like super page down or Windows key page down. You can also see which application you have open. So for example, you can see an application that you have currently selected, and that always lets you know which application is being focused on, so you always know which application you've clicked on. So you don't have to rummage around or click around with your mouse to figure out which window your mouse is actually in. You will always know because of the little text right next to the activities dots. And in the middle, we have the clock and notifications menu combined. And if you also have them installed, you can also have things like clocks for other regions of the world, especially if you're communicating with people in other regions of the world, or the weather of the area that you live in. And then lastly, on the right, we simply have the power button, Bluetooth, volume, and wireless activity, all packed into like one little thing. Now, this is all well and fine, but how does GNOME's guidelines actually translate to using a desktop environment? Well, for one thing, you'll notice that with all GNOME desktop apps, each app is designed to be completely adjustable no matter how big or small or thin your screen is. And that's actually really important. If you're someone who likes to have lots of windows open on one display or workspace, you can size these windows and they will always have everything available. Because keep in mind, there are applications that may not necessarily follow this rule. And this is why GNOME doesn't use something like a taskbar at the top of the window. Instead, they have little hamburger menus or other settings icons that you can click on. If you have only one input method, let's say you're using a touchscreen, or you're using a keyboard, or you're using a mouse, or if you're only able to use one of those things. Let's say I'm on the internet, browsing my favorite hen videos, and you're watching your videos and you only have one hand available. They can always use the entire feature set of the GNOME desktop environment with varying degrees of access, obviously, but it's still accessible and usable. And that's one of the things that's actually one of the most special parts about the GNOME desktop. Whether you are someone who focuses on using a mouse-based workflow, or you're someone who likes to use a purely keyboard-driven workflow, both people can have a similar enough user experience where they can be happy. Speaking of opening applications, let's get into that. Most people open their applications by clicking on something like a start menu, for example. Or if you're a tiling window manager user, you open something like a run launcher, like say dmenu or Rofi. GNOME has all of those things, except they're just baked into one thing, and it's called the GNOME Activities view. The GNOME Activities view is kind of like one of those launchers, but on steroids. It has integration into all of GNOME's application suite, and you can use it to access any application or any built-in feature or file on your computer. And that's one of the coolest parts about it. With the GNOME Activities menu, you'll notice that when you start typing in your search, applications are always given top priority compared to something like, say, your files. Let's say you want to type an emoji. On something like Windows or KDE, you'd have to have a separate hotkey which opens an emoji menu, which is totally divorced from any other UI out there. Or if you're using something like macOS, you're forced to have a key dedicated for it on your keyboard. But with GNOME, and you have GNOME characters installed, all you have to do is start typing in which emoji you want in the dash. But it's not just limited to something like your emojis. Let's say you want to get some quick maths done. All you have to do is have GNOME Calculator installed. Type in the equation you want solved, and GNOME Calculator will do it on the fly right there. You have a file on your computer and you don't quite know where it is, and you don't want to use a really heavy search function? Try GNOME's Dash. If you start typing in a file, and even if you roughly know the name of the file, never mind the first couple letters of the file, you will always be able to find your file because GNOME indexes all the files on your computer. And if you don't want to have your files indexed, you can actually opt out of this so that these extraneous files aren't included in GNOME's search. Now, a common thing that you'll hear from people or see online is that people often try to do things with GNOME that work a little differently, or the GNOME's developers expect a different kind of behavior out of whoever is using their desktop environment. For example, you'll notice on the window bar when you have a window open that there's no minimize or maximize button. But why is that? Why is there no minimize and maximize button? Well, it's actually done for the people who are either using touchscreens or for people who are acclimated to using something like a mobile device, or for people who are using the Windows hotkeys. So let's get into this. The maximize is accomplished by either using a key binding, like say the Windows key and the up arrow, or you can drag the window up to the top part of the screen and the window will maximize and take up the full portion of your screen. But how come minimizing isn't there either if you can still maximize your windows? But how come you can't minimize your windows? Well, minimizing windows is considered to be something that's not necessary in the GNOME desktop environment. Now, I know people are going to be busting out the pitchforks on that one, but there's actually some truth to this, especially if people who use tiling window managers, they understand this full well. And this is why I say GNOME is kind of like a tiling window manager. And if you approach it with the same mentality, you'll understand why they made this decision. The reason why you shouldn't have to minimize windows is because you have access to dynamic virtual desktops. What does that mean? GNOME can generate infinite numbers of dynamic workspaces, and you can store a single application for each specific task. And that's one of the coolest parts about GNOME, because no other desktop environment on Linux, heck, even Windows and Mac OS, don't have access to such an easy-to-use dynamic workspace feature. Another criticism that GNOME gets is, how come there's no desktop icons? The reason there's no desktop icons is because your desktop icons are actually all in the GNOME Dash. Using GNOME's Dash, you will always have access to any application that you want open, or any windows of any open application that you need. And you'll be spending a lot of time in here to either select applications or click on windows, but using this feature, you won't need to have something like desktop icons. But where will I store my files, you might ask? Just store them in a different folder. You just won't be storing them on your desktop. Because of something like a desktop, especially because Windows are going to be covering it, imagine how many windows you're going to have to minimize or sift through just to get to your desktop. Whereas when you just store it in, let's say, a file manager window, all you have to do is just put them in a folder that you know where they're going to be, or you can always pull up your files by typing into the search bar. And this is why people who are diehard GNOME users say this: if you don't need something open, just close it. And that's why there's only a closed feature. If you're just going to save something for later, you just don't want to see it, dump it in another virtual desktop. You have an infinite number of virtual desktops at your disposal. But let's also get into window switching. GNOME has access to an Alt tab, and it's really similar to Mac OS's Alt tab. But a lot of people really don't like Mac OS's Alt tab. They say, why is it limited to applications? How come some of the applications have an arrow underneath them? Well, the reason why this way is because while you can Alt tab in a traditional way to cycle through your windows, One of the other things you can do is you can Alt tilde. And the Alt tilde lets you cycle between all of the windows of the application you have currently selected. If you have an application, like say a terminal with multiple terminal windows open, or if you're using something like Firefox with multiple windows open, what you can do is first you need to Alt tab over to focus on Firefox, and then to cycle through your Firefox windows, you do Alt tilde. This means at any time you have full access to any window of any application you want, and any application's windows once you focused on that application. And once you've selected that application, GNOME will immediately move to that workspace or to wherever you stored that window. This way, you will always have access to any window that you have open, and you don't have to think about what number desktop did I store that on. No, you will always have it available, and that's one of the coolest parts about GNOME. So, go out there and use the GNOME desktop environment. The reason why I shill the GNOME desktop environment so hard is one, because I'm an NVIDIA user and I'm forced to use it. But the other reason that I use it is because it's a good way of introducing people to Linux by not making it something that's not like Windows, not like macOS. By showing people that it's something completely different and they can't approach it the same way. That's why the GNOME desktop environment is the way that it is. It's designed to be the face of the Linux desktop because it's something so different from the standard Windows and macOS looks and feels. So why don't you go leave a like on this video. Leave a like on this video if you want to see me break my promise again of reviewing all of GNOME's ecosystem suite of applications. Alright guys, thank you for watching. I will see you guys next time. Have a great rest of your week, and why don't you go give GNOME a good ol' whirl.